This is Gridiron Graduates, a weekly podcast covering all things football. Episode number 4, Backed into a Corner, with special guest Matt Harmon, recorded June 24th, 2015.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, friends. Welcome to another edition of the Gridiron Graduates. I'm your man, Bill Rossetti, guiding you as always. Hope you had a good week, and welcome back. As always, I'm joined by my good friend Ian Wharton. Ian, what's going on, buddy?
Not too much, man.
Nice. And it's more than two of us this week. We've got a guest joining us in the classroom, so to speak. This guy, of course, is the creator of the one and only Reception Perception. You've seen him on Football Guys. And starting the season, you will see him at a special place that I'll let him talk about in a little bit. He's the one, the only, Matt Harmon. Matt, what's going on, buddy? Welcome to the show.
Thanks, fellas. It's good to be here. Excited to talk to you guys tonight. We've all followed each other for a long time now, so it'll be good to chop it up here and share some thoughts back and forth on the airwaves with your listeners.
Absolutely. Glad to be here. And why don't you go ahead and tell the listeners and viewers about that special place that you are going to join this
special place. It sounds like it's some mystical forest. Yeah, well, I guess in some ways maybe it is. But yeah, I just have taken a real big boy job at NFL.com as a full-time fantasy writer. So yeah, it's pretty exciting. It's kind of the culmination of a lot of work over the last year and a half. Which really isn't that long in terms of journalistic careers or whatever. So I'm pretty fortunate, and I feel really lucky and excited to get started out there. So it means a big move out to Los Angeles. So maybe that is sort of the special place we're talking about. But yeah, it's going to be exciting, and I'm really grateful. And there's a lot a lot of people that have got me here, and you guys have been around since the beginning, so it'll be cool to talk to you guys tonight.
Absolutely. Well, we're glad to have you here, and we definitely congratulate you on your move, and certainly wish you the best of luck. So we're gonna get started here. I said we're gonna talk about wide receivers and corners because, of course, the two guys here, Matt has reception perception with wide receivers, Ian has coverage productivity, talking about cornerbacks, but I think we should talk at least a little bit about the big news this week in football, and that, of course, the Tom Brady appeals meeting took place Tuesday night, wrapped up after about 10 hours. Probably not going to get a decision for quite some time. Ian, I'll start with you. What were your thoughts as we went through the appeals meeting and what we can expect in the future?
I just couldn't believe that it lasted so long. I mean, is this really that big of a deal that, we need to spend an entire day in court? I mean, it's, obviously the on-field effect, it could actually have a somewhat decent effect on what happens this season. Him being suspended a few games, obviously it depends on how Jimmy Garoppolo plays. I mean, he didn't look very good last year when he got some playing time late in the season. And, there's a couple teams trying to creep up on the Patriots in that division. I think the Dolphins, the Bills, the Jets. I mean, those are three pretty solid football teams. Obviously, the quarterback position for the Bills and the Jets still very much in the air, especially the Bills. I mean, we've seen 2 rumors already in the last month saying that they could cut a different quarterback, E.J. Manuel and Matt Castle. We've seen both of those rumors out there. So, it's one of those things where it's like until the Patriots don't win the division, it's hard to imagining them not winning the division. But I think that the other teams are closing the gap a little bit, especially with the Patriots losing so much defensive talent in their secondary this year. It's going to be impossible to compensate for losing a guy like Darrelle Revis. You just kind of brace yourselves and hold on. Mm-hmm. So, it's hard to be too negative about it because on the other hand, it's maybe just the first 2 or 4 games that Brady could be missing, maybe none at all. Who knows how this is going to work out. I just thought it was interesting really how long it took for them to go over everything.
Yeah, definitely. And I just want to mention, you talked about the Bills. I just was always taken aback every time I see reports are saying Tyrod Taylor is in the mix to start for the Bills. That's when you know you have a problem at quarterback, when Tyrod Taylor could possibly be in the mix to start. But yeah, and the interesting thing about this is if it's a decision that Brady doesn't like, does he risk taking this to federal court and possibly pushing the suspension further into the season, possibly into the playoffs? That I think is going to be really interesting to watch. Matt, what's your take on this?
Yeah, I thought it was funny too how long it took. I mean, what they say they spent like 10 hours in the courtroom. Mike, like, what were they talking about? I just imagine, they all get around and
they're probably playing tiddlywinks or something there. I don't know.
Probably like shooting dice or playing poker or something. I know at one point they said that there was like, they ordered a pizza or something. I don't know. There was a lot of jokes flying around. And it's always funny, when something like that is taken so seriously. I can't imagine what kind of deliberation or court process would have taken 10 hours to talk about that. But that's, like Ian was saying, the on-field perspective, I'm with him that I'm really interested to see, how the Jets, especially the Jets, doing fantasy stuff. You look at Chan Gailey, some of the offenses that he's been able to kind of cook up with, substandard personnel. You definitely want to look at how, and they seem pretty confident in Geno as their starter. They've already come out and said that he's going to be the guy. So that's interesting to me to see how they play. They've got two really good wide receivers on the outside there, and an interesting guy in Devin Smith that I liked a lot in the draft. So that could be a pretty good offense with a defense that looks really nasty, especially the two cornerbacks that they added this offseason, as well as some of the guys on the front line. And then Buffalo, of course, has that great defense, and they traded for LaShawn McCoy. They have some offensive talent, but yeah, you mentioned it. I mean, Tyrod Taylor's in the mix to start. They might cut like Matt Castle and EJ Manuel, who knows? But I definitely want to see Tyrod start just for the laughs, And being a Virginia guy, he went to school at Virginia Tech. That would be kind of fun to see him get a shot at legit playing time. And I mean, why not? You know what Castle is, and it's pretty funny that Manuel's already been written off, 14 starts or something into his NFL career. You don't see that happen too often where young quarterbacks get chance after chance. But, yeah, and I like the Dolphins too. I wrote a column a little while ago looking at their receivers, and they've definitely got an interesting offense too with some good pieces on defense. So there are some solid teams behind the Patriots, but kind of like Ian said, I'll believe that the Patriots don't win that division when I see it. I wasn't a big Garoppolo fan coming out, but I mean, he could probably get them through 4 games if the aforementioned Matt Castle could get them to an 11-5 season a few years ago. I could see Garoppolo, just tossing it to Gronk 15 times a game and that being good enough. So we'll see what happens.
Exactly. And we mentioned this on the previous show, but I'm just going to run through the first 4 games for the Patriots. Obviously, the opener against the Steelers, the Thursday night. At Buffalo, week 2, then they host the Jaguars week 3, and then at Dallas week 5. They have a week 4 bye. So definitely, even if Brady's out those first 4 games, I don't see this team going any worse than 2-2. And again, like we mentioned on the previous show, they started 2-2 last season after the embarrassment of Kansas City, and the rest is history. We all know what we said, and we all know what happened after that. Everyone had egg on their face. So now that we got that out of the way, let's move on to the brunt of what we're going to talk about today. As I mentioned before, both these guys have great projects they're working on, focusing on different positions. And first, I just want to talk about your projects in general and just how you got started and things like that. And Matt, I'm going to start with you. What led you to starting Reception Perception, and how have you grown, and just kind of give us the backstory on it.
Well, from a career perspective, I kind of decided when I first – one of the pieces of advice I would always get from writers whenever I'd ask, hey, how do I get your job or whatever, they would always respond with, well, you have to do something to stand out. You have to have something that people associate with you. When they think Matt Harmon, they think this. They think this, series or this approach to things. So that's really why I wanted to come up with something, like Reception Perception that was really close in line with myself and people would associate with me. And hopefully that would lead to a lot of attention, and it did. So that was successful in that way. And as far as what made me want to do kind of analytical slash, quantify the tape sort of project was I've always been a really research-based, in-depth sort of person. My intention. I know Ian's done a lot of post-bachelor work, academic-wise, and that was kind of a path that I wanted to originally go down. I wanted to go back to school and get a PhD. I was always really an intense, researcher, really combed through a lot of data type of person. So that was something that appealed to me was to take a look at one position and really try to create a statistical approach to things that wasn't really out there. Maybe try to quantify how often receivers are getting open, and that's pretty much what I do at this point with reception perception. And I wanted to do receivers because I think it's a fun position. I think it's also right now you look at how many talented wide receivers there are in the NFL. There are some veteran guys that are still holding it down, like the Andre Johnsons of the world are still playing pretty well. And then this influx of new talent, whether it be, Des Bryant, Demaryius Thomas from a couple years ago, and now you're looking at Odell Beckham, completely breaking the mold, along with some other really good players from that class. It's an exciting time for wide receivers, so I thought this would be a good time to kind of introduce this methodology to really study these guys in depth. So a lot of factors went into the decision to why to make it, why to put it out there, both for myself and for just the knowledge of the game, I guess. But yeah, so it's a really fun project, and I'm kind of sort of finishing my work for this year on it, where I'll put out a project about these second year wide receivers from the historic 2014 class. So it's going to be fun to kind of release some of that data in a couple months and let people kind of know where the project stands.
Nice. And we'll go to the other side now. Ian, you of course have coverage productivity, focusing on cornerbacks. So I'll ask the same question to you. Give us kind of the backstory on your side.
Yeah, so I've always kind of been like a project-based person. Like I like a lot of little projects and just kind of ways to kind of challenge myself, to kind of do something new, to kind of keep myself busy in my free time. It's just one of those personality things. It's really funny that, when I was working at the University of Houston doing my master's degree, person that just like, I need to get stuff done. Like I literally can't go to bed at night without feeling like I did something. Like I've got to feel like I accomplished something. And it was really funny because like I never understood that. Before that test, like I knew it about myself. It was like a subconscious thing where I was like, I knew that I kind of like to work, whether it's like enjoyable work or whatever it may be. I enjoy it. And this kind of project really kind of embodies that for me because it's very tedious. It takes a long freaking time to do.
Amen.
And I know Matt understands that 1,000%. It is until you chart something, you don't. I really feel like you don't know how tedious it is until you chart something.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's ridiculous. So like just doing, I added up all the numbers just from like the AFC cornerbacks that I did. I've charted over 3,000 individual routes, and that's not just snaps. That's just routes that qualify for what I'm looking at. So it's like, I enjoy it though. Like I really do. And for me, cornerbacks have always been kind of something special. It's always been kind of something I've just really enjoyed, whether it be like Madden growing up. I really liked cornerbacks for some reason. I was enamored with like the speed, the instincts, the ability to like make a playmaking play like that as a defender. I don't know, for some reason it just always resonated with me. And just playing, football through high school and such, I didn't play cornerback, but I always just enjoyed that side of the coaching. And so for me, it was kind of natural. And I always saw kind of a lot of cornerback analysis out there, and there's really no way to analyze, I should say, cornerbacks. People look at interceptions, they look at tackles and passes defensed, and that's basically it. And QB rating against. And I just don't feel like those are accurate ways to look at a cornerback and say if they're good or not. You look at the Des Bryant play at the end of 2014, where he apparently didn't catch that ball. And if you look at it from the other side of the view, if they would have ruled that a catch, do you say that that's a bad defensive play? And reality is that's just an incredible offensive play, and I don't think that the defender should be really penalized for that. And that just happens by every single game, and it happens maybe 3 or 4 times a game. And so when I was, just kind of looking for something to do, looking for something to work on and bring light to, I found cornerbacks as a natural place, not only for myself, interest-wise, but also kind of there was a hole in the market. There's no one really looking at cornerbacks. So I really just thought, that would be a great thing. And then just kind of expanding it, also seeing a little bit what Matt does, charting the individual routes. That was something that I added later. Kind of breaking it down more, taking what someone else did and said, I could better my process by doing that and being willing to adapt it to really just be more descriptive with it. So, I think it's really fun, and I think it's going to be really cool that we're both doing these things that kind of not necessarily compete against each other, but really can complement each other on a week-by-week basis.
Exactly. And the nice thing, too, that with both your guys' projects is that these are two positions that it's pretty tough to really get a hold of if you're just sitting watching on TV, because obviously the broadcast angle, you really can't see the wide receiver, the cornerback. The only time you see those positions is if it's on a replay and they're really only focusing on where the ball went. You don't get to see the entire play. So you guys are really bringing light to, how the receiver's running the routes or how the corner's defending the routes or things like that. So I just want to say, God bless you guys for all the time you put in. Because, like I said, I know it's definitely a grind. So I think I speak for a lot of people when I say thank you and God bless you.
Well, like Ian said, it's fun. I enjoy the process of it too.
Exactly, and that's definitely the bottom line of it. As long as it's fun for you guys and the readers and everybody enjoy it, that's really what it's all about. So now that we've discussed how you've made your projects, let's talk about some of the players that could fall into your project. We kind of want to match up some players and see how you guys think about these guys and how they could match up. And one player in particular that I think people wanted to see us talk about was Joe Hayden of the Cleveland Browns. So I'll have Ian talk about what he thinks about Joe Hayden, and then we're going to match him up with, I actually decided to put him up against two AFC North guys. We talked about putting him against Antonio Brown, same division, and then I also I had someone ask last week to match Joe Hayden against AJ Green. So we're kind of going to talk about those three guys, if you don't mind. So Ian, we'll start with you. Kind of talk about what you see in Joe Hayden, what you like, don't like about him. And then Matt, talk about, we'll start with Antonio Brown. And we could also maybe, because I'm sure you guys have watched these two against each other, so we can get your thoughts on these two against each other as well as individuals.
Yeah, so I think, starting with Joe Hayden, I think the first thing that, just kind of give a background on him, obviously he was a big-time player at University of Florida, was a big recruit coming in, ended up having a really good college career there, ran the slow 40 time, still went in the top 10 to the Cleveland Browns. And I think that kind of set the stage for expectations and kind of where the general public feels comfortable with on their stance on him. He's kind of a guy, if you ask the Joe Schmo about him, they're probably going to put him as a top 5 cornerback. And a big reason why is going to be his ability to make turnovers. So he had 3 interceptions last year, 10 passes defensed, which that's a pretty good number, the 10 passes defensed. But kind of breaking down Hayden, he's very sloppy mechanically. He's a guy that he likes to gamble, and he's going to basically he's going to think he sees something and act on it as quickly as possible, which isn't anything uncommon. I mean, you see guys like Asante Samuel. He's the same type of cornerback. He's a high risk, high reward type player, and that has led to Hayden giving up some really bad touchdowns at some very critical junctures of the season. For the Browns, he gave up 4 touchdowns last season, 781 yards. The one standout stat that he has is he's got 53% completion percentage against, which that's a pretty good number comparatively across the league. But he doesn't really cover routes extremely well. Just looking at my numbers that I've got, he struggles breaking inside which isn't a shocker because you look at his 40 time, and it kind of reflects that as well. He's vulnerable on deep routes, and he's vulnerable on sharp turns where he's got to turn and accelerate. He doesn't really do that extremely well. He's just a very inconsistent player, and he helps make up for it by creating those turnovers and creating the big plays. Some people prefer that, and I don't have anything negative against people that prefer more high variance players. It's just when you look at the cornerback position, those few plays a game that you gamble and you lose can ultimately lose you the game. And on the other flip side of the coin, when you only have a handful of interceptions a year, it's tough to justify taking a more high variance player over a more solid, competitive player every single play. When you compare him to a guy like, for example, Xavier Rhodes doesn't get interceptions. It's his one big flaw in his resume. However, he covers guys extremely well. He's always right there at the catch point. He is very, very physical throughout the routes. I'd rather have a player like that's going to compete on every single play, and it's going to come up with some more difficult plays at the catch point, as opposed to a guy like Hayden who's going to get lost a little bit in routes, even against very average receivers. He's been burned by a couple of very mediocre receivers through his time, and then of course against some of the elites he does okay. Most specifically, AJ Green. For some reason, AJ Green is a guy that he is locked on and always wants to play. But even against like Antonio Brown, as Matt's going to talk about here shortly, he just really struggles against guys like that. So, and in fairness, a lot of guys do. That's a guy that really destroys a lot of cornerbacks. So you can't be too harsh on that. But Hayden's a guy I think that where his draft spot was and his reputation coming out is something that really has helped him. And then obviously the fat contract that Drew Rosenhaus got him. That's another indicator for people that don't really watch the game as intently, snap by snap, that, it's an indicator that he's really good when in reality, it doesn't necessarily reflect his overall effectiveness every single play. You're really paying for the hope that he gets better every single play, but also the variance, and you're hopefully raising that floor and then keeping that ceiling still as high, which is very difficult to ever expect out of a cornerback. It's just there's probably 3 or 4 cornerbacks playing at that level every single week, and I definitely wouldn't put Hayden at that spot right now.
All right. Matt?
Sure. So starting with Antonio Brown, and I thought that a lot of what Ian said really was representative of Hayden's game. I don't obviously chart the cornerbacks. Everybody always says, how can you account for matchups and stuff like that with your receiver data? And that is something that I would love to take into account, down the line or whatever. But that's not something that I do right now. But you get a good feel, and I'm sure Ian feels the same way about the receivers. You get a good feel for a player's game just by charting the guys going against them. And I thought when Ian said that Hayden struggles when he's asked to make those sharp cuts and things like that, well, that pretty much screams Antonio Brown to me. I mean, especially a guy who really has maximized everything that he's given athletically. And I know he wasn't a good tester when he came out in the draft, and that makes a lot of sense because he wasn't a highly touted player. He's a 6th-round pick. He had to pretty much work to get to this level. And it makes you wonder about the guys that are smaller. How do they win? And they win with quick twitch ability and really good fluidity, and that's what Brown has developed into. And obviously, I think he maybe isn't one of those guys who doesn't test as well at the combine or at his pro day. But then when he gets on the field, when he gets the pads on, he's able to really he's definitely more of an athlete than he is as a tester, and that makes sense. I mean, there are a lot of guys that are like that, and for Brown, he really is technically sound as well. He does everything really well as a route runner, and that's why he has the second highest score against man coverage that I have, and by far the best score against zone, because he's also a really intelligent player. He doesn't make a lot of mistakes. He knows how to find the soft spots in a defense. And as it pertains to matching up with a guy like Hayden, you see a lot of even some of the best corners in the league get kind of taken for a ride by these smaller, quick twitch, technically sound receivers. I mean, I know that when Richard Sherman went against Odell Beckham, he had some problems because he's that bigger press man corner, but he's not as, and even Hayden didn't run a great 40 time at the combine or anything like that. I think there were some athletic questions with him. You see those guys get taken for a ride a little bit by the smaller guys, like Brown, the ones who are really disciplined in and out of their breaks, and can set defenders up with some intelligence. And Brown is definitely the consummate guy when it comes to that in the NFL. I mean, there are some bigger guys who are, freak athletes like Des Bryant, but for my money, if you need a guy to create separation, I think Brown is one of the best in the game, if not the best in the game. I know as far as reception perception goes, he came out as one of the best. And what you look at that is really impressive is that you talk about how that Brown is a quote-unquote small receiver, but he does play big. I mean, he has a really good contested catch conversion rate for me. He's able to the smaller guys are really able to use positioning and body control to kind of maximize their frame. And, I know Odell Beckham, I talk about him, he's a freak leaper. Brown isn't that sort of guy, but he's studied how to set these defenders up to be in the right position when the ball arrives. And, he can go up and get the football, but I think it's a lot more of just technique and discipline and doing the same thing on a consistent basis that helps him win in that regard. So when he goes up against a guy like Hayden, you see him being able to use that technical discipline, but also that fluidity and quickness in and out of breaks. And I think that gives guys like Mr. Hayden some trouble. So Brown is good against everybody, like Ian said, but you definitely see him succeed against those types of corners just because he has a complete and well-rounded game. And AJ Green, it's funny because especially prior to this year, while Green is a great player and he's one of the best receivers in the game, I think he's not as great as a route runner as some of the other top guys, on the receiver power rankings or whatever. I think especially again prior to this year, he's really fast. He can, for his size, he can use the sideline well. He's really consistent with his body positioning. But sometimes, I'm not saying he's a lazy player, but he doesn't run routes consistently to the same speed or at the same position every time on the football field. And I know Mike Wallace is an interesting example of a guy that struggled with that in Miami. But Green is obviously, is much better than Wallace. He's also has a bigger frame, so he can get away with it a little more than Mike Wallace can, and can still make plays even with in Green's case, a much more limited quarterback. So why I think but he doesn't have that necessarily that consistent quick twitch that Brown does. So a guy like Hayden is able to stick with him a little bit better. So it's funny, you see there's definitely some people really do prefer bigger wide receivers, and it's obvious why big wide receivers give you an advantage because, it increases the strike zone. It helps you can make more vertical plays with bigger guys. But it is funny because the smaller players like Brown, when they can and they need to do a lot more work to get to that level, but they can really create ample separation for quarterbacks to throw into, even against good cornerbacks, because they can use their not limitations, but they can maximize the technique and everything to get to a point where they're creating a lot of separation. And some of the quarterbacks in the league today are really the sort of see it, throw it type of guys. So players like Brown really give you that opportunity to have a lot of space as opposed to throwing into tight windows, which a lot of quarterbacks just don't want to do these days. So it's interesting that, we talk about these two specific players because they represent kind of a larger point in the league today.
Mm-hmm. And Ian, I want to go back to you. After Matt was just talking about AJ Green, I want you to talk about what you saw in Joe Hayden, if you got a chance to watch him against AJ Green. And I also then want you to talk about another corner that you were interested in talking about, and that was Vontae Davis. Of course, the Colts and Bengals met twice in the playoffs, or twice last season, including in the playoffs. So Davis got to see AJ Green a little bit. So talk about Hayden against AJ Green, and then Vontae Davis against AJ Green.
Yeah, I'm really glad that that we kind of brought up AJ Green a little bit because Matt, I don't know about you, but I was when I was watching him last year specifically, I kept coming back to the thought that he feels a little overrated. And I know he had some injuries last year, and I know that there were issues with a new offense. Andy Dalton was really struggling with consistency, and you could just really see the frustration of AJ Green just boil at the end of the season. Like I mean, you could visibly see him just be upset almost after every single passing play. I just thought it was interesting that you brought that up on Green because I feel like a few weeks ago someone had tweeted, what's your top 5 receivers, and a lot of us answered. And I mean, for me, Green wasn't even a guy that I would put in the top 5. And a lot of that again may have been injury related. I've seen him prior to last year, but obviously last year is going to stick the most in my mind. It's just very interesting that was kind of brought up. So I'm glad that you brought that up because it's one of those things where do I feel like I'm really seeing that, or did I actually see that? So that's good to hear.
No doubt, and I don't want to interrupt you, but that is Green's a tough player because he is definitely limited by the quarterback. But I do try in my process. I do try to isolate, what's going on with the quarterback and what's going on with the receiver as far as what they're doing before the ball is thrown and everything. Are they winning in the routes? I think Green is a really good player, and I do think he could put up some astronomical numbers in a different system. But like I said, some of these big guys do get lazy with the technique. Julio Jones is another player that I struggle with this same sort of thing, even though both these guys are really talented players.
Yeah, for sure. I'm glad that you brought up Jones too, because I agree with him. Going back to Hayden and looking at his matchup with AJ Green, I do agree. I think it's a skill set thing, and just mentally, he's always talked a big game about playing AJ Green. Before games, you'll see with reporters, he'll just light up when it comes to AJ Green. He knows that that's his biggest competition, and I think he needs to maybe shift that now to Antonio Brown, the way the Browns really torched the Browns the last couple of years. But I think it's very interesting just from a mindset perspective. He always just seems on point every single play against Green, and that may be, like Matt said, more of a skill set matchup. So I would agree with that. Interestingly enough, kind of in my rankings, I've got Joe Hayden as the 18th best cornerback just in the AFC, just from the numbers, the raw numbers, not looking at anything else, just raw numbers wise. He's 18th, and then I did want to bring up Vontae Davis because I got him one spot ahead at 17th. Looking at how often he's getting beat, that's also including interception numbers. He's more of a mid-tier player to me instead of an elite player, and it was really interesting because he had a good season last year. It was his best season of his career. He's finally starting to turn things around. He's no longer showing up drunk to practice. And late to meetings and such, which was a big problem in Miami. And so he goes to Indianapolis for a 2nd-round pick. It's really funny because the Dolphins were shocked that they could get that type of value for him, especially with his reputation, and off of Hard Knocks too, which Hard Knocks was not really a good look for him. The way he just he's almost like a child. He was a child back then. He was very, very immature. So he goes to Indianapolis, starts to turn things around. Obviously there it's been a little bit easier for him to adjust to the NFL lifestyle, which is great. And he has some elite type numbers. I mean, Pro Football Focus had charted him. I think he allowed 44% of completions thrown his way, which is a fantastic number. But ultimately, I broke down his film and I was actually really disappointed because this was he's a player that's got all the physical tools. He's fluid, he's fast, he's somewhat instinctual. He's better at the catch point than anything else, where he will make an aggressive play towards the ball at the right time. But usually that's overcoming what he did wrong earlier in the route. And he relies on that so much that he's letting guys get open far too early and far too often. Now, what helped him is that literally his teammate Greg Toller is the 2nd worst cornerback I've charted so far. He is giving guys so much space just throughout the entire route. And it literally almost every route that I charted, he's letting guys get open almost 50% of the time. by what I look for as far as guys getting open. So he's just like a revolving door. I mean, if it's a good quarterback, he's targeting Greg Toller first read every single time. And I think that Davis kind of benefited from that so much that he wasn't targeted as often, obviously, because Toller was getting so many targets. And the few times he was getting targets, he was playing well enough to kind of earn that high distinction. I've seen people talk about him as the number 1 or number 2 cornerback in the AFC, and I just think that's kind of crazy. The AFC is loaded with great cornerbacks. You've got Jimmy Smith, Darrelle Revis, Chris Harris. To me, those are by far the 3 best. And even the 3 best, I'd say even possibly in the NFL. To put Davis in that type of company, I think is just a little premature. He's not technically close to even sniffing that type of level. There's just way too much going on with his lower body throughout any type of comeback route, any type of sharp cut route. And it's not a physical thing where it's like Hayden, you can tell, is just physically limited. Davis is just not quite aware yet of when that's about to happen, when the cut is about to happen, where it's about to go. There's even times where you'll see him cheating inside and the receiver just darts to the sideline instead, to the outside route. And there's too many examples of that for me to put him in that elite company, although the tools are there. And then kind of to compare and contrast him to a former teammate, Sean Smith, for the Kansas City Chiefs, he's kind of gone the other direction. So he's a height, weight, speed guy, was brought into the league. He athletic freak as far as all of his measurements. He's kind of gone the opposite. He's went from relying on those physical tools to now he's an excellent cover corner. He is constantly at the catch point. Even when he's not right there with the receiver, he's got that 6'3" frame to come back on and that 4'4" speed. And that's constant. And so he is constantly in the face of a receiver, challenging the catch process. So it's just kind of interesting to see where those two have gone. Obviously, both Dolphins, former Dolphins, and early round picks. Davis was a first rounder. Sean Smith was a second rounder.
I just want to apologize earlier for that little unintentional soundbite that played earlier as I was trying to check the Browns schedule just to see when Hayden and AJ Green will match up again this season. They will have a Thursday night game in Week 5, November 5th. So that'll certainly be interesting to watch. I just want to ask a quick question to the two of you as well. If somebody, let's say, some of the listeners or whatever want to start watching some of these players, or start charting receivers and corners or whatever, and you had to give them one player at your position that you think, this is who you should watch because he does X, Y, Z well. This is what you need to look for, whatnot. What player would you tell them, and why should they watch this player? Why would they? What do they do that can help them in their film studies as they watch other players? And Matt, I'll start with you.
Well, other than stay off my turf, no, I'm just kidding. I would say one of the players that challenged me the most this offseason watching, and I've talked about him on Twitter recently, especially when Ian, like Ian mentioned, there was a conversation recently about your top 5 receivers or whatever. One player that really challenged me this year was Demaryius Thomas. And I would encourage anybody that was going to start, scouting receivers or charting receivers to take a look at Thomas's tape, because obviously he's a really highly regarded player that puts up some huge numbers in Denver's offense, playing with Peyton Manning. But I would say that you come away a little unimpressed, sort of how we were talking about Julio Jones and AJ Green. I think Thomas is even a more extreme version of the two of those guys who Thomas is really, we know he's a freak. He blew out the combine like a lot of these Georgia Tech receivers do. So that's not surprising. But he also, despite putting up these great numbers, has really never developed into a technician, into a complete player. He runs pretty much 4 routes really well. He runs the slant, the screen, the post, and the go route incredibly well. He scores well on those routes. He comes up with a lot of I chart fantasy production for each route. That's where, I mean, if you're looking at a pie chart, that's where like almost all of his production comes on those screen slants and go routes. So he's a guy that you would say is a limited player. He's a role player, but he is just so good at that role. He's so good at what he does. So it kind of gives you that picture into what I really think people overlook with wide receivers is, obviously I would not call Thomas a technician. I would not call him a complete player. But he's an awesome player. He's a really good asset to his NFL team. I mean, that cannot be questioned because you look at what he gets done in that offense. You look at some of the just dominant games he can put up. So I think it kind of gives you a picture into what is really a larger theme with receivers is that they don't necessarily need to check all the boxes, but if they have what I like to call a trump card in a certain aspect, then they can get by on the field. They can be an asset, and even they can be a number one receiver like Thomas is. Obviously, I think his numbers are definitely helped by having a Hall of Famer at quarterback in an up-tempo, aggressive offense with good play callers. I think that's certainly helped him, no doubt about that. But at the same time, Thomas, he's really good at the few things that he is really good at. I mean, like astronomically good at them. He's definitely the best yards after catch receiver I've charted. He's incredibly good with the ball in his hands, and it makes sense because he's got great gifts. So I would encourage anybody to look at a player like Thomas who's going to challenge you, who's going to kind of illuminate that idea that this guy might not be good at everything, but he's really good at these one things. And while you might not think he is a top 5 receiver, I came away thinking he's probably not in the same class as like a Dez Bryant or a Jordy Nelson or an Antonio Brown. Like I would take those guys over Demaryius Thomas, but you still come away really impressed with a limited faction of the game. And while you would say, oh, well, if a defensive coordinator can hone in on that and stop that limited sort of stuff that he can do, then he's going to be blotted out of the game plan. But I mean, come on, obviously we do not see that come to fruition on Sundays.
Right. And Ian, before I get to you, I'm sorry, I just have one quick question for Matt again. We thought that obviously, some of the listeners may not have heard of this, but if you've ever heard of the route tree, if you want to explain, let me say, for the listeners who aren't aware or have never heard of the route tree, if you want to go ahead and explain to those people what the route tree is.
Yeah, so I mean, you can find, if you want to look at a route tree, you can find plenty of diagrams on my Twitter account under the hashtag reception perception, or there's something that I always include in my articles is like, because I break down how many times they run each route, or what percentage of their total routes are slant or posts or whatever. But yeah, each route there are 9 routes on the tree, and then I've also added a few others because there are some like off script routes, but such as a screen or fades and everything like that. Right. So yeah, but basically the route tree is it's broken down into 9 parts, and it's the slant, there's the dig route, the out route, the flat, the go route, which is just the 9 routes straight down the field, a post, a corner, and I'm blanking a little bit. Oh, the post and the corner. I don't know if I mentioned that, but anyways, yeah. So it's just basically what the receiver is going to do on that play is he's going to run one of those designated routes. And obviously, sometimes, especially with a quarterback that gets off script like a Russell Wilson, you see his guys sometimes break off those routes. But most of the time there are designated patterns that a receiver is going to run, and the route tree really just diagrams that well. Mm-hmm. It's kind of like you look at it like spokes on a wheel, like a wheel has different spokes coming out. The route tree has different kind of lines coming away from the straight pattern where they start. So it's just a really simple breakdown of what a receiver's assignment is going to be.
Right, and basically it's where, like you said, there's 9 routes, 0 through 9, and the higher number the route is, the further the route goes. and I believe it's odd numbers is to the outside toward the sideline, even numbers is inside. And when we talk about the route tree, 0 is considered an even route because I think 0 is that quick slant, isn't it? Or 0, it's a quick slant or quick in or one of those short routes. But in any event, it's a quick inside route. It's an even number, goes to the inside. Odds is to the outside. But that's basically the route tree. So, all right, Ian. Like I said, I'm sorry I had to make you hold your thought there. But go ahead with your answer.
Yeah, so I think the one guy I would want people to start with is probably Darrelle Revis. And because for me, I would start with Revis because to me he's the pinnacle. He is the most elite cornerback in the NFL, and I think he has been for the last 5 or so years. I think that Revis really, and part of it is also my preference. So I like physical cornerbacks. I like guys that are going to be willing to punch you in the face, hit you in the chest, drive you out of bounds on a press, guys that will stick with you the entire route, pull on you a little bit, nag on your jersey. I like that because ultimately it's gamesmanship. And if the ref's not going to call it, then it's fair game. These guys are at a huge disadvantage every single week. Most of these guys are lesser athletes than the players that they are lining up against every week. I think it was Daniel Jeremiah that tweeted it earlier this week or maybe last week. He had mentioned just the vast difference in quality of edge rushers to offensive linemen and then also wide receivers to cornerbacks. And he's absolutely right. I mean, there are so many good receivers right now, and there are just so many teams lacking good cornerbacks. And there's a reason why. I mean, it comes down to money. It comes down to what's easier to play. And for me, Revis is just kind of the guy that embodies the perfect cornerback. He's fast. He's fluid. He's incredibly intelligent. I cannot tell you how many times I've seen him run a route better than the receiver and get to the catch point before the receiver is even close to getting there. I mean, the study, the film that the guy does, the film study he does, it shows every single week. And he matches it with excellent technique, great physicality, and his focus, too. I mean, you got to give guy credit for his focus to be able to be on every single play. I think that he's a guy that you can just, when you watch him, you can compare every single player in the league to him, and 99.9% of the time you're going to say that player wasn't as good as Revis. Jimmy Smith, I think last year played better. I had Jimmy Smith as a better player last year. Now, that being said, he also had a lot less snaps. He only played in like 5 or 6 games. So I would still stick with Revis. I think that Revis is a guy that everybody can like. Even though he's physical, he's not overly physical. A guy like Jimmy Smith is a little overly physical still at times. But Revis is definitely the starting spot because I think it helps to see where the best wins and how they win. And then from there, you can take that and you can watch college prospects kind of with an eye. Now, again, it changes in style. Matt, I'm sure, can talk about this. He already did, actually, with receivers. A.J. Green style as opposed to Antonio Brown style. It's the exact same thing with cornerbacks. You're going to find guys that are better suited to man coverage like Revis. You're going to find guys better suited towards zone. And even in there, you're going to find different types of cornerbacks. You're going to find more quick twitch guys like Brent Grimes. And then you're going to find more physically overpowering types like Stephon Gilmore. Gilmore's more of a tools type than he is necessarily a quick reaction type. So I think Revis shows all of that. He's got the complete package. And then if you want to start to try like breaking that down a little bit, we could just go on there for days. But I mean, Chris Harris is another guy that I'd want people to look at too because he can go inside, he can go outside. He's quick. He's got great speed. He's incredibly intelligent. Again, that's another. It's a slightly different style because he plays in the slot. The slot requires a different skill set than the outside, and I mean, there's really no doubting that. But I think those two are the guys that stylistically you can get a complete picture of what a slot cornerback should be and what an outside cornerback and man coverage can be.
Nice. And from what you're talking, I was gonna throw a little wrench and say if you had to choose someone other than Darrelle Revis, but it sounds like you were you're probably going to go with Jimmy Smith if I were to ask that.
Yeah, I'd probably go with Smith from last year. Like I said, it's a limited sample size, but he was so good in that limited sample size. I mean, I had him getting beat 16% of the time. Really, the only route that he had any type of struggle with was, I guess, the dig route, but he only had 5 that I charted against him. So, I mean, you take that with a grain of salt. If he can stay healthy for an entire year, I'd love to see what his numbers end up turning out to be like next year.
Right. And again, that's just another example of how the Ravens continue to scoop up value at the end of the first round, like they seem to do every year. But so good choice there. One more thing I want to ask, and this is toward Matt. I want to ask you about one of the young guns that you feel is poised to have a breakout year, and as a Penn State grad, I'm pretty happy to see you writing about this guy. And you could probably guess who I'm leaning towards. That's my boy, Allen Robinson. Go ahead and talk about Robinson, what you liked about him, and what you're expecting out of him this season.
Yeah, man, Robinson was one of the fun ones to chart because you see right now, I mean, he's all the rage. I mean, there's a lot of hype coming out about him, from OTAs and especially in the fantasy world. He's a guy people are getting excited about, with all this hype going on. But yeah, so it's funny now because I can sit here and say, like, well, about 2 months ago, I charted his reception perception sample and wrote an article on Backyard Banter, which is just my blog, that Allen Robinson is poised for a massive breakout. And it's funny now that like it's almost commonplace. Of course, obviously he way before reception perception he was, and people always, whenever I shamelessly plug, before all this minicamp hype, reception perception showed that Allen Robinson was going to break out. People will always come back and say, well, hey, also before that his college tape and his workout metrics showed that So anyways, it's not like I'm gonna claim that I was first on Allen Robinson when I definitely was not. But anyways, the cool part about Robinson was, obviously he only played a couple games, or not a couple, but a few games to start this year. I think he was about 10 before he injured his foot. And you think about Robinson, he is a big guy. He's 6'2", over 210 pounds. So he's a big receiver. And you see pictures all over the internet of him, leaping to these astronomical heights. That's something that's made, I know there's one at Penn State. Now there's one going around from mini camps of him just making these incredible leaps. And he does have, I think, like a 40-inch vertical or something like that. I mean, he can jump out of the, he can jump out of the building. No doubt about that. But when you look at his reception perception numbers, he's he scores really well on the short routes. I mean, the flat 87% success rate, slant routes in the 80%, curls, digs, all of these routes, that are more short to intermediate patterns, he's executing those really well. So he's kind of one of those big receivers that wins in the small areas of the field, which is rare. He's not necessarily as a rookie, he wasn't necessarily making these big downfield plays. So what that indicates to me is that he's going to be a guy who just gets pumped with targets this year for the Jaguars. And I mean, just watching his tape, you can tell that Blake Bortles trusted him above all of the other, haggard rookie receivers that he was working with last year. And obviously Julius Thomas is going to cut into that volume a little bit because he's going to, especially in the red zone. But I expect Robinson to get around. I know RotoViz, a great fantasy website, also projected him for about 130 targets. I could totally see that happening just because, I know the Jags want to run the ball. They want to be a ball control physical offense, but they're still going to fall behind in a lot of games, and they're going to have to chuck the rock. And I think that as long as Robinson stays healthy, he can definitely approach those big-time target numbers. And with how successful he is on short routes, with that great potential to be a contested catch player, with his vertical leap ability, you could see him just soak up volume in that offense. You're going to see him catch a lot of passes. So I really do expect some big numbers from Robinson. Obviously, when you're talking fantasy, and that's going to be my job now, so I have to think of it in that way. How often is he going to score? That's kind of a question because of the offense that he plays in. But
Right.
I was surprised because he's like what, still 22 years old.
Yeah, he's
like
still young.
he's very, very young. He's a puppy in terms of his age.
Mm-hmm.
But he's a really technically sound and disciplined player for a young guy. So I'm really excited about him going forward. Probably over a lot of the other popular guys from that 2014 class. I think Robinson's going to outproduce a lot of guys this year.
Right. And he definitely seems like he's a good complement to the other receiver they took in that second round, Marquise Lee. And like you said, they're probably going to
it helps that Robinson's like actually a good player, where Lee is kind of not. But anyways.
But yeah, like you said, they're probably going to be throwing a lot because I still think they're a team on the rise, but they are still probably going to lose a decent number of games. The offensive line is still a little bit of a question mark. We'll see how that develops. I know they took a center in the third round, so we'll see how everything comes together. But definitely all the Penn State grads listening right now, I'm sure we made you guys very happy that we're talking positive about a guy like Allen Robinson. And since you are going to be an NFL fantasy writer, we could call you Michael Fabiano Jr. or something like that. Where would you draft Allen Robinson?
It depends on what format you're playing.
Let's say it's a standard 12-team PPR format.
I mean, PPR, like I said, I expect him to catch a lot of passes. I mean, his current average draft position before all this minicamp hype was in the 8th or 9th round of PPR, of 12-team PPR drafts. I would feel comfortable taking a shot on him in the 6th or 7th, and his ADP is going to climb from here.
Oh, yeah.
Obviously it's not going to be there now. I'm trying to pull up more recent data, and just over the last 2 weeks, it's climbed from the 8th round to the 7th. So you're going to have to start paying that price for him. If the hype keeps on going, it's going to get up into that 6th or 5th round range. But I'm gonna be comfortable in that sort of 6th round range because he's a guy that you can take as a volume-wise, you want to take guys who are going to be the number one targets on their team. Unless it's like Sammy Watkins, where the quarterback position is just such a wasteland. I would rather have a team's number one receiver on an offense where they're not going to be very good and they're going to have to pass a lot, like the Jaguars, because he's going to soak up those targets. It's different when you're playing for Rex Ryan. He's going to just stubbornly run the ball, and his receivers hardly ever get over 100 targets. But for Robinson, it's going to be good because he's going to get those targets, and that in fantasy, opportunity is really the name of the game. And Robinson, I think, is going to get a lot of opportunity. So when you look at him in that 6th and 7th round range, I'm totally comfortable with that. And if he keeps adding to the buzz, that price is going to keep coming up. So you're going to have to monitor that throughout the summer.
And I'm just looking quick at my fantasy league, their ADP there, and this is draft since June 1st. Now, for those listening on other days, obviously, you're obviously not listening to this live. We're recording this on June 24th. These are drafts since June 1st. Robinson is actually wide receiver 27 right now with an ADP of about 63. So you're talking that's early 6th. And you brought up a great point. That ADP is going to steadily climb as this hype train just keeps going. I mean, it's only the end of June. Once they get the pads on, it's just going to continue to climb. Even right now, the next 2 guys after him are Nelson Aguilar and Brandon Marshall. He's ahead of Andre Johnson. He's ahead of Devontae Adams. So it's definitely interesting seeing some of the names he's ahead of. But it just goes to show you how deep wide receivers are when it comes to fantasy.
That's why you take your running backs early.
Exactly.
Especially in basketball leagues. But,
I'm an advocate of running backs early and wait on quarterbacks and receivers. But, boy, that hour sure went fast, gentlemen. Matt, I want to thank you so much for joining us on the show today. I hope you had a good time.
Absolutely, this was a lot of fun. It was good to talk about kind of the interesting dichotomy between the wide receiver and cornerback position, especially as it relates to the different types of cornerbacks, different types of receivers. I really respect Ian's work, and it's cool to see somebody kind of doing the parallel of your own work. So it was a lot of fun to talk, guys.
Absolutely. And Ian, as always, another great week. Glad you're always on board, and thanks again for another great show, man.
Yeah, man, just really excited. We've got some great guests. Matt, obviously, fantastic to talk to you. Obviously, your work is fantastic. Can't wait to see what you're putting out at NFL.com. Big fancy NFL.com now. So I can't wait because I'm going to be like, yeah, that guy that you're reading, that's my buddy. So
we knew him when he was little old Matt, and now he's working with Matt Money Smith. And tell Michael Fabiano that Daniel Bryan is going to be back as world champion.
Much love, guys. I appreciate it.
All right. In any event, guys, thanks as always for listening. Really appreciate it. Remember, we're on iTunes. You can subscribe there. You can always hit us up on Twitter. Ian is at NFL Film Study. Matt is at MattHarmon _BYB, MattHarmon _BYEB. And I am at Bill _Rossetti, RICCETTE. Thanks for joining us. Remember, next week Sigmund Bloom will join us, so get your question in for the man himself. And until next time, take care, everybody. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.